The musicale at Amesbury House began at 8:30, and by 9 o'clock, Eliza Ravenscroft had been pretending not to hear Lady Dorothea Whitecliff for the better part of 20 minutes. She stood at the far end of the room near the tall windows that looked out onto Grosvenor Square, because at the far end of the room there were fewer people she was obliged to speak to, and the windows offered something to look at besides the assembled faces of a London drawing-room that had, as a body, decided her guilt 18 months ago, and not revised its verdict since. The gown she wore was dark blue, trimmed with ivory at the cuffs and collar, retrimmed twice, at least the fabric still good, but unmistakably the gown of a woman who had lost access to her dressmaker, along with everything else. She held her program in both hands and kept her chin level. She was 27 years old, and she had not fled London, and she was not going to begin tonight. Lady Dorothea sat not 15 feet away, angled toward Miss Cecilia Vane with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 40 years arranging herself to maximum social advantage. Her diamonds were very fine. They always were. She held her fan at the particular height that indicated she wished to be overheard by some portion of the room, and not by others. And she said, in a tone shaped to carry exactly as far as it intended, that it was rather singular, was it not, how the guilty Duchess still persisted in appearing wherever decent people gathered, as though persistence alone might eventually be mistaken for innocence. Miss Vane smiled. It was a small smile, calibrated to indicate sympathy with the sentiment while maintaining her own deniability. She was very accomplished at such calculations. Eliza felt the words land, as she had felt them every time Dorothea said some version of them in her hearing, as a slight pressure at the center of her chest, a thing she absorbed rather than flinched from. She had learned the distinction in the first month after Edmund died. Flinching cost something. Absorbing cost something too, but it was a quieter cost, paid in private. She looked up and across the room, past the clusters of guests and the pianist, settling herself at the instrument. She met the eyes of Callum Ravenscroft, Duke of Wycliffe. He stood at the entrance to the room, just arrived, and he was watching her with an expression she had stopped trying to interpret. Dark coat, white cravat, the jaw held as though he had set it in that position some time ago and forgotten to release it. His eyes were hazel, and in the candlelight they looked very nearly black. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than strictly accidental, and then he looked away. Eliza looked back at the window. She had not spoken to him at length in 4 months, and at length was perhaps too generous a description of what that conversation had been. The pianist began the opening movement of a Haydn sonata, and the room settled into its polite arrangement of listening, and Eliza kept her chin level and her hands still on the program. And she thought about the walk home and the cold supper Mrs. Peel would have left, and the manuscript she was copying for Mr. Haverley the publisher, which needed to be returned by Thursday. She thought about all the practical things. She had become very good at thinking about practical things. If you are joining this story for the first time, stay close. What comes next took 18 months to arrive, and it arrived on a piece of paper sealed with Edmund Ravenscroft's own wax. It is worth the wait. Eliza Hartwell had married Edmund Ravenscroft, the 9th Duke of Wycliffe, on a gray October morning 6 years before his death, and she had done so with what she later understood was an incomplete picture of the man she was marrying. He was charming then, witty and attentive and possessed of the particular talent some people have for making the person in front of them feel that they are the only person in any room worth speaking to. She was 21, and her father was alive, and she believed that what she felt was the real substance of something. The years corrected her. Not brutally, not all at once, but in the incremental way of a garment slowly going to thread, the deterioration too gradual to point to any single instance, and name it a breaking. Edmund drank more than she had known. Edmund's moods moved without warning. Edmund had debts she was not informed of, decisions that were made without her. Portions of his life kept partitioned from the shared life they were supposed to be living. She kept her counsel. She managed the household. She was faithful to him in every sense, because she had promised she would be, and because she was not a person who revised her promises downward when they became inconvenient. He fell ill in the winter of 1813. It was a wasting illness, slow and certain, and in the final weeks of it Edmund became a version of himself she did not recognize, agitated and accusatory, unraveling in some way she could not stop. She sat with him. She read to him. She brought the broth herself, when the footman was slow. And in the second week of March, in the presence of Lady Dorothea and his solicitor and 2 other witnesses, she had not been informed were coming. Her husband sat up in his bed with what appeared to be a final and furious clarity, and said that his wife had deceived him, had conspired with a named gentleman she had never met to defraud the estate, had been faithless and scheming from the beginning, and that he was dying with the satisfaction of knowing he had seen through her at last. She stood at the foot of the bed, and she did not say a word, because there were no words adequate to what was happening, and because she understood, even in that moment, that any protest she made would be rendered into further evidence. Dorothea's face was composed and certain. The solicitor's pen kept moving. Edmund died 4 days later. Within the week, Callum Ravenscroft, who had adored his brother and trusted his brother's word as an article of faith, informed Eliza that her widow's portion was suspended pending a formal review of Edmund's claims, that the dower house was required for estate purposes, and that he would see she was provided for in modest terms until the matter was settled. His voice had been level, not unkind, exactly, in the way that a perfectly aimed thing may be delivered without cruelty and still strike true. He had believed Edmund. Of course he had. Edmund was the man who had raised him. The modest terms were a quarterly allowance sufficient for a cottage and plain food. She took the cottage on the eastern edge of the Wycliffe land, partly because she could not afford to be further from it, and partly because leaving England entirely would have looked like the flight of a guilty woman. And she was not guilty, and she did not run. Mrs. Peel came with the cottage, which was the only piece of luck the 18 months had produced that Eliza was willing to name. She was a stout woman of 55, with a talent for warm bread, and an absolute refusal to believe that any woman who read as much as Eliza could have done the things she was said to have done. She said as much the first week, and then she did not say it again, but it had been enough to know someone else in the world held the thought. Eliza found the copyist work through a letter of introduction from her cousin in Bath, who knew someone who knew Mr. Haverley, who published philosophical texts and the occasional novel and required a careful hand and a reliable turn of phrase and could not afford to pay much. Eliza charged what she needed and did the work well. It was not a life she had expected. It was in a way she had not yet found the right word for, more entirely her own than any life she had lived before. It was on a Tuesday, in early April, that he arrived at the cottage. She had known he would come eventually. The lease arrangement required a formal annual review, and the estate agent who usually handled such matters had apparently taken ill. She heard the horse on the lane and looked out the window and recognized the set of his shoulders before she could see his face. She had the door open before he reached it. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," he said, which was the title he had given her in the official paperwork after the formal review concluded with no resolution, which was his form of acknowledging that the accusations had not been substantiated, while declining to retract them. He had not called her Duchess. He had not called her Eliza. He removed his hat and stepped into the cottage. She offered him tea, because it was what one offered, and because she had determined very early that she would not let him see her rattled. He sat in the chair near the fire, which was the better of the 2 chairs, and she sat across from him, and she poured, and he asked about the condition of the property, and she answered. And this was how it went between them. He was very large in her small sitting room. She was aware of him in the particular way she had been aware of him at every social occasion since Edmund died, which was the awareness of a woman who wished she did not notice things about a specific person, and noticed them anyway. The way his hands rested on his knees, the single crease between his brows that deepened when he was thinking. The fact that he had looked at her across the musicale room for 2 seconds, and then looked away, and the fact that she had counted. "The roof of the eastern outbuilding wants attention," she said. "I will send someone," he said. "The lane floods in heavy rain. It has been impassable twice this winter. I will have the drainage examined." This was how he showed care, she thought. Not warmth, not acknowledgement. Small procedural things carried out at a distance. She did not know what to do with it. She had learned not to build anything on it. "Is there anything else?" he said, and his voice had the level tone she had come to recognize as the voice he used when he was working very hard not to use any other. "Nothing that requires your attention, Your Grace." He stood. He took up his hat. At the door he paused, and she thought for a moment he might say something that was not about drainage or roofing. And then he did not, and she let him go. She stood at the window and watched him ride away along the flooded lane. And she thought that there was a great deal of room between the man she suspected he might be and the man he was actually allowing himself to be, and she could not live in the distance between those two things. She had tried. It was not a livable distance. It was 3 weeks after that call at the cottage that she first saw him watching her without knowing he was there. The lending library in the village was kept by an old woman named Mrs. Crow, who was generous with her hours and strict about returned books and made excellent use of the small back parlor for those patrons who wished to read on the premises. Eliza went every Thursday. She had fallen into the habit of reading aloud to Mr. Hobart, who had been a schoolmaster in the village for 30 years before his eyes failed, and who came to the library for the company as much as the books. They were working through Cowper's poetry, which he had loved since boyhood, and which she found she could render in a way that pleased him. She did not advertise this. It was simply a thing she did on Thursdays because she was there, and he was there, and no one else had thought to do it. She was part way through a long poem about the countryside, Mr. Den. Hobart's head tilted toward the sound of her voice, and his expression carrying the particular piece of a man hearing something beloved when she felt the prickle of being watched. She looked up. Through the library's front window, across the half-visible street, she caught a dark shape in a dark coat. Still, and she knew the set of those shoulders. Callum stood at the window. He was not moving. He was watching her with an expression she could not read from that distance, though the stillness of it was legible enough. He had not known she would be there. She could see that in the quality of his stillness, the sense of a man who has stopped mid-stride because something has surprised him into stopping. What she could not see, from where she sat, was what the stopping had cost him. He had been on his way to the estate agent's office, a dull matter of fencing along the north pasture, and he had turned the corner, and there she was, framed in the library window, her copper-brown head bent toward the old man beside her, her lips moving, the manuscript propped in her hands. She had been reading for what he understood must be some time, because the old man's posture had the settled quality of a person deep in something they had not wanted to end. She was not performing it. There was no audience she was aware of. She was simply there, giving her Thursday afternoon to a man who had no other claim on her time and no means of repaying the gift. And she was doing it with the same composure she brought to every room, the same quiet that he had been misreading, across all the months, as something cold or withholding. He stood at the window for a full minute. She looked back at Mr. Hobart and continued reading. When she looked up again, Callum was gone. He said nothing to her about it at the dinner at Amesbury House the following week. He was seated beside Miss Cecilia Vane, who was in ice-blue silk, with her hair arranged in the most fashionable style of the season, and who spoke to him in a low and musical voice about the progress of her father's estates, and he listened, with every evidence of attention. Eliza was placed at the far end of the table beside an elderly baron, who was kind and slightly deaf, and who occupied her pleasantly for the full length of dinner. She watched, when she could not help watching, the particular angle of Callum's jaw in candlelight. She noticed that he did not laugh. She noticed that he looked at Miss Vane with the same level attention he gave to drainage surveys. She noticed things she had no right to notice, and she said nothing, and she ate her soup and she was 27 years old and still in possession of her dignity, and she intended to remain so. There is a small thing worth pausing on here, a moment that comes to feel, in retrospect, like the hinge of everything. Eliza did not know that, on the morning of that dinner, he had received a letter from Reverend Aldous Pemberton, requesting an urgent private meeting at the vicarage. She did not know that Callum had gone that same afternoon, or what he found there. She would not know for 3 more weeks. Reverend Pemberton was 68 years old, and had served the Wycliffe parish for 34 of them. He was a quiet man, methodical in his duties and sparing in his words, and he had a habit of folding his hands when he was about to say something that cost him something. He folded them now, across the desk of his small study, with the sealed document between them. He had been the late Duke's pastoral visitor in the last weeks of the illness. He had sat with him on the days when the family had left him, and the servants had been sent out, those hours of the small hours when a dying man sometimes speaks with a different mouth than the one he used in company. He had done so not at Edmund's specific request, but because it was his duty, and because something in the quality of Edmund's agitation, in those final days, had told him his presence was needed. On the second to last night, Edmund had been unable to speak aloud. He had indicated, through tremendous effort, that he wished to communicate something, and Reverend Pemberton had given him paper, and Edmund had written. It had taken a very long time, and cost him a great deal. What he produced was a single handwritten document of some length, rambling in parts, the hand deteriorating as the pages progressed, and he had indicated that it should be sealed and kept until his death, and then delivered, at a moment of the Reverend's own judgment. Pemberton had waited 18 months, because he had needed in his conscience to determine whether the document would serve justice or simply cause fresh suffering. He had concluded at last that to withhold it any longer was itself an injustice. Callum opened it in Pemberton's study, at the Reverend's invitation, and read it in silence. Most of it was what a dying man said when he had nothing left to protect. Edmund had admitted the debts, their true origin, the calculations he had made and the lies that had covered them. He admitted the unnamed gentleman he had accused Eliza of conspiring with was a man with whom he himself had dealings, a man whose name was now in print in a financial scandal Edmund had not lived to see conclude. He admitted what he had done and why he had done it. And the why was the part that Callum had to read twice, because it was the why that broke something. Edmund had been afraid that the debts would be discovered, afraid that the scandal would fall on the family he had spent his life cultivating to a particular image, afraid most specifically that Callum would think less of him. That Callum, who had always trusted him, who had built his entire sense of the world on the foundation of his brother's character, would see him clearly and find him wanting. So he had done what frightened men sometimes do. He had built a fire elsewhere to draw the eye, and in the middle of the letter in the deteriorating hand of a man who was not going to be alive to face the consequence of what he was writing, in a line that sat alone on the page as though it had required all the remaining energy of a body in its final hours, he had written, "She was innocent of every word I spoke against her, and the fault was mine alone, and she knew nothing of it." Callum sat with that sentence for a long time. Pemberton did not speak. He understood this was not a silence that wanted company. Outside the vicarage window, the village went about its Tuesday business. A cart went by. 2 women with baskets talked at the corner. Someone in the distance was calling a child's name. Ordinary sounds, in the afternoon light, and inside that room he sat, very still, and felt the architecture of the last 6 years shift under him. He had trusted Edmund. He had based everything he believed about his own character on the foundation of that trust, on the certainty that a man who trusted as completely as Callum had trusted was a man of good judgment. He had believed the condemnation of Eliza without question, because disbelieving it would have required disbelieving Edmund, and disbelieving Edmund was not something he had known how to do. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the most consequential way he could have been wrong, and an innocent woman had been paying the price of his certainty for 18 months, in a too small cottage, with a flooded lane and a quarterly allowance, and a retrimmed gown. He sat with the letter a long time after that, though the afternoon light had shifted and the study had grown cooler, and Pemberton had quietly left the room and returned with a small tray of tea that Callum did not drink. He sat with the sentence. He sat with the knowledge of what Edmund had done. Not once, but over years. Building a lie in the architecture of his closest relationships. And then at the end, detonating it with the timing that most advantaged the reputation of a man who was past all consequence. He thought about all the things he had told himself. That he had not judged too harshly. That the evidence had been clear. That a woman of character would have been more distressed, more vocal, more obviously wronged. He had told himself all of it, and he had believed all of it. And every version of it had been a lie. He had accepted because the alternative required admitting that his brother, the person who had raised him and shaped him and represented everything he believed about loyalty and duty, was capable of something he could not forgive in anyone else. He thought about Eliza at the musicale, standing at the tall windows, her chin level. He thought about Eliza at the cottage, answering his questions about drainage with the same composure she had brought to every humiliation the last 18 months had produced. He thought about the first morning he had come to inform her of the suspended allowance, and the particular quality of her silence. Not deference, not defeat, but something he should have recognized and had not. He folded the letter. He placed it back in its cover. "I will need this," he said to Pemberton. "I expected you would," the Reverend said. He did not go directly to Eliza. He understood, even in the considerable distress of that afternoon, that to go directly to her would be to do this wrong. There were things that needed to be properly ordered, because she had been disordered. In public, and the correction needed to be public too, he went home to Wycliffe Hall. He spent 2 evenings. Alone in his study, the letter on his desk, and he thought about Edmund, and he thought about Eliza, and he thought about all the moments across the last 18 months when he had watched her hold herself together in rooms that were trying to pull her apart, and he had told himself he was not watching, and he had believed that too. The first sign that something was breaking came to Eliza, not from him, but from Mrs. Peel, who had been to the village market on a Wednesday morning and returned with her basket and a particular set to her expression that Eliza had learned to read, as news that was not entirely welcome. "It is nothing that need trouble you," Mrs. Peel said, setting down the basket. "Ah, tell me," Eliza said, Mrs. Watt. Peel had overheard at the stall where she bought her onions. 2 women she recognized from the edge of the assembly circuit, discussing the previous evening's gathering at Ashwood Park. Lady Dorothea had been there, and had said apparently in the hearing of several, that now that the arrangements between His Grace and Miss Vane were progressing so favorably, the matter of the guilty Duchess might at last be considered resolved, that the quarterly allowance would be tidily ended with the new marriage, that it was past time London stopped having to look at her. Eliza stood very still with her hands at her sides, and she heard this, and she breathed through it. "She's mistaken," she said, "about the arrangements. I expect so," said Mrs. Peel, who was not as certain but who understood her function in this moment. Eliza went back to her copying. The manuscript was due Thursday. She was not going to weep over an onion stall conversation. She had not wept in a very long time, and she was not planning to begin. She went to the Hartwell Assembly on the Friday, because she had been going to the Hartwell Assembly every month for the entire 18 months, and she was not going to let Dorothea Wycliffe determine what she attended. The room was small and warm and smelled of candles and too many people, and she arrived with Mrs. Peel in her good dark blue, and she greeted the people who would receive a greeting, and she found the quieter corner near the refreshment table, and she held her program, and she waited. Callum came late. He entered the room with the contained quality of someone managing a great deal of internal weather, and his eyes found her immediately, which was the kind of thing she wished she did not notice, and noticed anyway. Miss Vane was already present in the far corner, very elegant with her mother. Lady Dorothea was at the center of the room, in state, her diamonds very fine. The assembly had been in progress for perhaps half an hour when Dorothea rose and, in the way she had of making a private action carry the weight of a public announcement, drew the attention of the room to herself with a word here, a gesture there, and then spoke at a volume calibrated to be heard by a gathering of this size, saying that she was pleased to share with their dear friends here assembled that she expected a most gratifying announcement from her son regarding Miss Vane very shortly, and that the Wycliffe family looked forward at last to a season of happier occasions. There was a murmur. Eyes moved inevitably to Eliza. She felt it as a specific heat, the collective attention of a room deciding something, the verdict settling over her again, like something heavy. She kept her face still. She kept her spine straight. She would not give them the satisfaction. She needed a moment of air, just one moment, and she found Mrs. Peel's arm, and said something quiet, and excused herself, and went out through the side door that opened to the small garden at the back of the assembly hall. The garden was cold. The April night had not yet decided what it was going to do with its temperature hovering at that uncertain point where a light shawl was insufficient, but a heavier wrap would have required fetching, and she had neither the shawl nor the patience for the wrap. She sat on the bench near the yew hedge, and she listened to the muffled sounds of the assembly through the wall, the scrape of chairs and the opening bars of a country dance beginning. She was not crying. She wanted to make that clear to herself, clearly and in those terms, because there had been a period in the first months after Edmund died when crying had come too easily, a leaking that felt like weakness even as she understood it was not, and she had taught herself to stop it. She was not crying. She was breathing cold night air in a dark garden, and she was 27 years old, and she had done nothing wrong in her entire marriage, or out of it, and she was very, very tired. The tiredness was a specific variety, not the tiredness of work, which she had come to find bearable, almost companionable, in the way that a familiar weight could be. This was the tiredness of maintaining composure in rooms that were trying to dismantle it, of arriving to every social occasion already braced, of watching Lady Dorothea arrange the furniture of social consensus with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing it for 40 years and had never once encountered meaningful resistance. Eliza had been resisting for 18 months, and she was good at it, and she was tired. She heard the door. Again, she did not look up. She did not need to. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," he said. "Your Grace," she said. His footsteps on the gravel, and then he was there, not sitting, standing a few feet from the bench, and she could feel him wanting to say something and not finding the opening, and she was tired enough that she did not help him. After a moment she said without looking up at him, "I know you believed him. I want you to know that I understood why even then. He was your brother, and you loved him, and there was no reason in the world for you to doubt him. I am not asking you to feel guilty for what you could not have known." She paused. "But I was not what he named me. I was never what he named me. And I want you to know that I know that, even if no one else ever does." She stood up. She smoothed her gown. She intended to go back inside with her composure intact, and she did. He stood in the garden for a while, after the following morning was Saturday. At 9 o'clock, Callum called on his family's solicitor, Mr. Guesty, Forsyth, and presented him with Edmund's confession and requested that its contents be formally noted in the estate records. Forsyth read the relevant passage 3 times. Then he picked up his pen. At 11 o'clock, Callum returned to Reverend Pemberton's vicarage and requested that the Reverend accompany him for the next portion of what needed to be done. Pemberton put on his coat. At 11:30 they arrived at the morning room of Wycliffe Hall, where Lady Dorothea was receiving 2 callers, a Mrs. Atherstone and her daughter, and where Miss Vane had been invited to take tea at Dorothea's specific arrangement. Callum entered the room. He did not sit. Dorothea looked up with an expression that managed to be both welcoming and braced, the expression of a woman who could read her son's face and was not certain she liked what she was reading. "Callum," she said. "I have something to share with you," he said, "and as you are all present, there is no need to repeat it." He took the confession from his coat. He read aloud the sentence. "She was innocent of every word I spoke against her, and the fault was mine alone, and she knew nothing of it." The room was silent. Miss Vane's cup settled in its saucer, with the faint sound of porcelain on porcelain. Dorothea's fan stopped moving. Edmund wrote this on his second-to-last night, Callum said. Reverend Pemberton witnessed it and held it at Edmund's direction. It is now entered in the estate records. Everything that has been said of Eliza Ravenscroft over the past 18 months was false, and I am informing you now because I will not have any member of my household claim ignorance of the truth going forward. Dorothea's face did something complicated. She looked at the document, and then at her son, and then at some middle distance that held neither of them. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than Callum had ever heard it. "He told me," she said. "He convinced me." "I know," Callum said. "He convinced us both. He did not say more than that. He did not press it." He looked at Miss Vane, who was sitting with the pale composure of a woman recalculating an entire situation very rapidly, and he said quietly that he hoped she would understand that he had never made her any promise, and that he was sorry for any impression his mother may have conveyed to the contrary. Miss Vane looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. A single clean movement, and she was gracious in it, and he respected that. He bowed to the room. He picked up his hat. He went out. It was a very cold April morning. The lane to Eliza's cottage was dry for once, and he rode it in less time than usual, or perhaps it only felt that way, and he knocked at the door, and Mrs. passed. Peel opened it, and her face went through an interesting series of expressions before it settled into something that might have been satisfaction. "Your Grace," she said. "Is she here?" "In the sitting room," said Mrs. Trocker. Peel, and stepped back, and he came in. Eliza was at the small table by the window with a manuscript spread in front of her, and a pen in her hand and her copper-brown hair pinned up imperfectly, one strand loose against her neck, and she looked up when he came in, and she did not pretend to be unsurprised. She had some composure. Her composure was, he had come to understand, very good indeed, and he could see the question in her gray eyes, and he did not make her wait for the answer. He told her about Pemberton. He told her about the letter and what it contained. He told her about Forsyth and the estate records. He told her about the morning room at Wycliffe Hall, and the sentence read aloud. She sat very still through all of it, the pen still in her hand, her face not entirely manageable. He watched the moment it landed in her, the thing she had known about herself for 6 years, finally landing somewhere outside of herself, finally existing in the world as fact, rather than as her own private conviction against the weight of everyone else's certainty. She pressed her lips together. She set down the pen. Mrs. Peel had made herself absent as quietly as only Mrs. Peel could. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he said, "She was innocent, and she is my Duchess still." The room held the words. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. This hand she had catalogued in rooms across the last 18 months, and then she placed hers in it, and he closed his fingers, and the warmth of it moved up through her arm and settled somewhere behind her sternum, and she thought, "There it is, the thing I did not let myself expect." "I owe you more than this," he said. "I am aware that this is insufficient." "It is a beginning," she said. He lifted her hand and held it against his mouth, his lips at her knuckles, and her breath caught in a way she did not attempt to conceal, and he kept his eyes on her face, and the quality of his attention was not the cold procedural attention of the man who asked about drainage surveys. It was the attention of the man who had stood at a library window and counted himself changed by what he saw. Later, she asked him what he had felt, watching her read to Mr. Hobart through the library window. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said it was the first time, in a very long time, that he had seen something and known, without calculation, that it was simply and entirely good. "And then you walked away," she said. "I did not know yet how to stay," he said. 3 weeks later, at the end of April, Reverend Pemberton performed the private ceremony in the Wycliffe Parish Church. 6 were in attendance: Mrs. Peel, Mr. Forsyth, Mrs. Atherstone, who had written Eliza a letter of apology that Eliza had read twice and then put away. An elderly cousin of Callum's who was the nearest thing either of them had to unambiguous family. Hobart, who sat in the front pew with his hands folded and his head tilted to receive the sound of the words. Lady Dorothea did not attend. She had removed herself to the Wycliffe seat in Cumberland for the remainder of the season, and Callum had not pressed her to do otherwise. He had told her simply that the door would be open when she was ready to come through it honestly, and he had left it there. It was, Eliza thought, the right decision, and the fact that it was his instinct told her something about him that she had suspected for some time. That evening, they were at Wycliffe Hall, which was hers again, in the formal terms that the solicitor had drawn up, and they sat in the library, where the fire had been lit against the April chill. The piano in the corner of the room was an old one, out of tune in the upper registers, and she had been playing it badly and with great contentment for the better part of an hour. She stopped, mid-phrase, because there was something she wanted to do first. She took the confession from the small table where she had placed it that afternoon. She held it once, looking at the line, the single sentence in her husband's deteriorating hand that had finally said what had always been true. She thought about him, briefly, and without the grief she had carried for so long, because the grief had been tangled up with the injustice, and the injustice was over, and what remained was something quieter. She folded the pages and she leaned forward, and she set them in the fire. Callum watched from the chair beside her. He did not comment. He understood what she was doing. The paper caught, and the sentence turned to ash, and she sat back, and she did not need it anymore because it had done what it had come to do. She returned to the piano. She began the phrase again, and this time she carried it through. He watched her the way he had watched her through the library window, with the quality of attention she was going to spend a great deal of her life learning to receive, and the fire crackled, and outside the library window, the April evening was going quietly dark over the grounds of Wycliffe Hall. She set her hands in her lap and turned to look at him. He was watching her with something in his face. She might have called at last the absence of the coldness she had always known was not the whole of him. "Play something else," he said, his voice low. She did. "If Eliza's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. These stories keep going because you do."